for the throne. It's gotta mean something, right? Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that this whole show has been all about this pointy chair that's extremely uncomfortable and it's caused pain and suffering for many, many people. That's just not how it's gonna go down. Instead, I see it being more of a put aside your differences, come together for this common cause, or we're all gonna die. As Daenerys mentioned in Game of Thrones Season 7, Episode 7, for right now, Cersei can trust that she's going to put that war aside. So the Game of Thrones, or this game of politics that they're all playing, is going to be set aside, and the main focus is going to be fighting the army of the dead. However, that does not mean that we are not going to get any drama and political intrigue next season. It's probably just going to be saved until the very last episodes. In this video, I want to discuss a leak that, for the most part, is holy Swiss cheese horseshit, but I kind of pieced it together with a little bit of theorizing of my own, and the big picture is important, and it will likely happen in Game of Thrones Season 8, or some version of it anyway. This video is to be taken with a grain of salt, and for more or less is for entertainment purposes. As always, here's your spoiler warning. Before we get started, please slap a like on this video as the like goal is going to be 420. Also, Fire and Blood comes out today. Make sure you stop everything you're doing and go and pick you up a copy. Also, please make sure you're subscribed and then make sure you have your notifications turned on so that way you get alert every single time I drop a Game of Thrones video throughout this long night. Okay, so like I said at the beginning of this video, for the most part, this leak does contain a lot of horse crap, but I've kind of trimmed it down to you and added a little bit of words to sort of make it, for the most part, understandable. This person starts out by saying that Jon, Daenerys, and Tyrion, as always, are going to be the main focus of the season. He goes on to say that Dan and Dave are going to be the directors of the episode, and their influence can be seen throughout this entire episode. For the most part, Jon, Tyrion, and Daenerys are going to be sort of given full circle arcs. He claims that this episode is going to be one of, if not the longest episode in Game of Thrones history, and it comes in at over 1 hour and 30 minutes. That's of course including the behind the scenes stuff. A big idea that Dan and Dave laid in our minds early on in the show, he mentions, is that Jon, Daenerys, and Tyrion claim that they are nothing like their fathers. Although Jon, for the most part, doesn't have anything against Ned, he does know that the way Ned played the game is not going to lead him down the path that's the best for his family. So there are going to be times in the season where Ned would have done something a certain way, and Jon initially, or intentionally rather, goes against his gut and does the complete opposite of what he thinks he should do. We saw that last season with him going to Dragonstone and then almost immediately regretting it. Then for Tyrion's character, he always hates the way that Tywin claimed that he was for family first, where really he had his own selfish motivations and just used the front of he's trying to better his family as a cover for his somewhat nefarious intentions. Then he mentions with Daenerys that for the most part, all of Game of Thrones Season 8, Daenerys sort of takes a backseat in a way. He mentions that he's not sure if it's because she's pregnant, or maybe it's because when she first arrives at Winterfell, the impressions that she gets upon the people that are there, she realizes that her coming across the same way she did in the Field of Fire 2.0 or the Loot Train battle is not the best way for the people that she eventually plans to rule. So for the most part, she takes a backseat to burning anyone and taking any kind of revenge against Cersei. But that all comes to a head in the final episode. Okay, so now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and read a direct synopsis that was sent to me by this leaker. Super air quotations there. But like I said, I added a little bit of pizzazz to it just to make it a little bit more understandable. Okay, so apparently, the entire season, Jon makes rash decisions, more so based on loyalty, honor, and in general, the right thing. Most times his terrible choices are saved by others, but Jon is given a secret from Tyrion regarding Cersei's baby. Just a quick reminder, those terrible choices he's talking about is how he mentions that Jon intentionally goes against his gut instincts. He goes on to state that, like Ned, since Jon is given this secret of a baby and decides not to tell anyone, that comes back to haunt him. After the major battles of the season, Tyrion confides with Jon that Cersei wants him to bend the knee. Of course, Tyrion knows that Jon would never do this, so Tyrion propositions Jon in a way that he hopes will convince Jon to do this. Basically, he tells him that if he lies to Cersei and agrees to meet with her, Tyrion is 100% convinced that he could convince Cersei to go and escape with her child. This would end a potential war and it would save thousands in the process. Tyrion then goes on to explain how the deal must be kept secret from Daenerys and that if she found out, she would never agree to it. Putting Jon in harm's way was the last thing that she would ever do, but Tyrion explains that if Jon doesn't do this, then maybe they won't be so lucky, or as lucky as they were in fighting the Long Night, and maybe one of them will actually die, obviously insinuating Daenerys. Tyrion then ends this conversation with Jon by mentioning how he's 100% convinced that Cersei would agree to this because Jaime's death would have softened her, and their child is the last Lannister. What a casual way to slip in the fact that Jaime is dead at this point in the season. Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but a lot of people theorize that the Golden Boy will go out fighting the Night King, or at some point during the season before the final episode, mainly having to do with his contract leaking. But continuing on here, in true Game of Thrones fashion, Jon immediately goes against Tyrion's wishes and talks this information over with Davos. Davos thinks he should meet with Jon Snow's small council, Tyrion excluded. Davos goes on to mention how better minds are suited for such tasks as deciding the fate of one of their greatest allies. Jon excludes the pregnancy and does not mention this to Davos. Jon then calls forth the aforementioned meeting, and it's decided that he should tell Daenerys of Tyrion's treachery, and she should be the one to decide over his trial. Jon then, of course, being a Ned Jr., remembers the innocent Lannister child and decides to go against everyone's wishes and thinks they should let Tyrion's plan play out and not let Tyrion know of their secret small council meeting. The Fleeker sort of mentions in the side note at this point that this is very similar to the game that Tyrion plays early on in season 2 when he's trying to figure out who's loyal with Cersei. Jon and his small council end up playing the same game with Tyrion and trying to find out if he's truly loyal to Cersei or to Daenerys. Tyrion and Jon then discuss the best options for meeting with Cersei. Daenerys is still unaware of any of this at this point in the season. It's then mentioned that for the whole season, the previous 5 episodes, Tyrion's actions all seem to revolve around allowing Cersei or Jaime to live in some capacity. Then after Jaime dies, those actions focus full on to Cersei. At some point during the season, Tyrion is called out by Varys. During this conversation with Varys, Varys being the spider, sort of tricks Tyrion into telling him what exactly was said during that conversation with Cersei. Varys mentions to Tyrion how ever since that convo, his actions have seemed to switch, and he can't exactly put a finger on where Tyrion's true intentions and his loyalties lie. And this is where Tyrion makes his fatal mistake. The big reveal from that conversation that we sort of got black screened on last season is apparently that the conversation ends with Tyrion pleading with Cersei that he promises her he will do anything he can to save her, and then she mentions that even if it means killing the foreign whore or the Stark bastard, even if saving her means betraying them and they have to die, Tyrion tells Varys that he agreed to this. Now bam, right there, that's where I'm going to drop in, pop in, and sort of pop a hole in this entire fleek. I mean, okay, you had me. You had me at the point that they are, like this video is named, they're supposed to be like their fathers in the end. And Dan and Dave have been telling this story all along. Let me rephrase that. Dan and Dave have been reinterpreting George R. R. Martin's story. So with any great adaptation, the reproducers, so to speak, get to put their own spin and flair on the direction the story goes. But just like with any great spin-off, we want it to end similar to the original content. Now at this point, Winds of Winter is scheduled to be out in January 2091. Just kidding, I had to slip that in there. But seriously, go grab yourself a copy of Fire and Blood. But with us fans of A Song of Ice and Fire not really knowing how the books are going to end at this point, I am extremely excited to see Dan and Dave's spin on this. Now I'm going to read the last paragraph of how this Fleeker says the season in, but I want to give you guys some example of how Daenerys, Tyrion, and Jon Snow have already been like their fathers, or more like their fathers than they actually know, and how this is going to influence them in the end. Well, I guess we'll start with Tyrion because that one's pretty obvious. Now, Tyrion's motivations, ever since he joined Daenerys' side, is that he wants to see his house fall down. He wants to see his sister die? Okay, well maybe that's taking it a little bit too far, but he definitely wants to see her removed from power in King's Landing. Now going into season 7, he obviously still feels this way, although after meeting with her and seeing that she doesn't immediately have his throat slit once she walks into the room, and she can successfully do this because she's, not next to Daenerys and her dragons, but she would obviously have to pay for it right away, but she has the chance to do this and she doesn't. So that giant icebreaker is sort of smashed out of the way with Tyrion not dying as soon as Cersei gets her chance. This brings him back into Tywin Lannister mode. In the books, Tyrion is said to be the most like his father. Out of all of his 2 siblings, he is the most like his dad in the sense that he's conniving, cutthroat, ruthless. At some point, you can see some good in them, but for the most part, their whole motivation and every action they take is going to be in support of their family and ultimately their own agenda. Dan and Dave, bringing it back around here, know this. So they want Tyrion to end in a very similar way than he does in the books. Now, I've said this about a dozen times in my videos, but the books have the luxury of spending many scenes that will further detail a character, that will give them many more levels of complexity, sort of like the onion analogy from Shrek. These things, however, are not possible, obviously, on a TV show, so Dan and Dave have had to pick and choose. But I sort of agree with this leak in the sense that they will try to end Tyrion's journey in a similar way that it will in the novels. And in the novels, it's very clear that Tyrion will have some sort of betrayal in him, in store for the endgame. Now, moving on to Jon Snow here, but not spending nearly as much time because we don't really have too much context for what this leaker says is going to happen. Now, Jon Snow did immediately go to Dragonstone last season. Now, this is not something that Ned would have done. If anything, Ned would have been the Sans of that situation and would not have gone against all of his advisors' advice. Then also you have Jon Snow in season 6 killing Ollie right away. I don't really know if Ned would have done this, but if Ned was killed and brought back, we don't really know. But if this leaked info is correct, or if something like this similarly goes down in season 8, I can sort of see it happening. We know that Jon in the novels is smart, cunning, and is actually pretty witty. He's got like a silver tongue. He says a lot of insults or, sly secondhand remarks to a lot of characters. One thing's for certain though is that he's extremely intelligent. So one way that Dan and Dave could sort of play this game of having him end a similar way of how he does in the books, if he even freaking comes back in the books, is by having him play this little game with Tyrion. Whew, this video is getting kind of long here, but let's move on to Daenerys and then I'll read the last part of this. Leak with air quotations. Okay, so the last time I went into a little mini rant about how I didn't necessarily 100% agree with Daenerys' actions in Game of Thrones Season 7, a lot of my really close subscribers said they look at me different now because they know that I'm a diehard Daenerys fan. So I'm going to somewhat shy away from that. But I will say that for the most part, Daenerys is being her own self. But when she does things like what she did in episode 4, not the entirety of it, but when she burns people because they refuse to bend the knee, instead of giving them time to think about their actions and maybe giving them a fair trial, she jumps the gun and burns the hell out of the Tarleys. That's something Aerys would have done. Her father, the Mad King, the one person she's trying so desperately to not be associated with in any sort of capacity. Now let's jump into this last paragraph. So apparently, for the entirety of the season, Daenerys behaves nothing like her father. And by this point, or where this last paragraph is sort of taking place, she's aware of Tyrion's deception. The episode starts with Daenerys finding out that Jon decided to meet with Cersei in secret. She throws Tyrion in a cell immediately after sharing a gut-wrenching scene with her, ending in Daenerys proclaiming that she will burn Tyrion once she returned, and there is nothing that will be lying there except for ashes. Hopefully she could word herself a little bit better than that, but continuing on here. And this is where it all sort of falls apart here. Daenerys burns almost all of King's Landing because Jon Snow is killed immediately upon arrival when meeting with Cersei. Jon Snow is later resurrected, but not by a fire priest in the traditional sense. Apparently Daenerys has to travel north of the wall for some sort of ritual, very similar way to how the Night King was created. Then he mentions that there's a bit of a time jump, and the last scene of Game of Thrones in all of its entirety is of Tyrion being beheaded and his head rolls to the camera. What the fuck? Okay, I've taken up enough of y'all's time. I want to thank you all so much for watching. If you could please share me your thoughts down below on all of this, whether you think it's credible or whether you think it's fake ass holy cheese horse shit. Please slap a like on this. The like goal for this video is going to be 420. Super special shout out to every single member of my Patreon family over on patreon.com/SirHuntsReviews. Make sure you're subscribed and then make sure you have your notifications turned on so that way you get alerted every single time I drop a Game of Thrones video throughout this long night. I want to thank every single person for watching this video right now. My name's Mark and this has been Sir Hunt's Review.